U.S. Ambassador to United Nations Linda Greenfield says the U.S. is committed to achieving peace in Yemen. UN Humanitarian Affairs Chief Martin Griffiths calls upon world leaders to double humanitarian aids for Yemen. The joint forces thwart Houthi rebels' attacks in different fronts within Hodeidah. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rana Swaylam. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, affirmed Washington's commitment to support unity, stability and territorial integrity of Yemen. According to Saba News Agency, Greenfield reassured the U.S. commitment to work with international partners, the UN and U.S. envoys to bring about a political settlement that ends the war and restores security and stability in Yemen and the entire region. The United States Special Envoy to Yemen, Tim Linder King, discussed the Yemeni crisis within UAE Minister of State Al-Marar and Ambassador Lana Nusayba. The diplomats addressed the need for the Yemeni cabinet's return to Aden to stabilize the Yemeni economy. The United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, noted the level of cooperation between the Yemeni government and the United Nations organizations and stressed that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains among the priorities of the United Nations. Earlier, Griffiths called on the international community to continue providing aid to Yemen. He indicated that the most vulnerable people are the ones who bear the cost of the Yemeni crisis, including women and children. The UN Humanitarian Relief Coordinator addressed world leaders on the bitter reality of the situation in Yemen. The following report looks in depth at the major issues raised by Griffiths during that meeting.
The crisis in Yemen, now in its 7th year of war, continues unabated, with thousands of people displaced and millions still away from starvation. The UN Humanitarian Relief Coordinator said on Wednesday during a high-level side event on the margins of the 7th General Assembly. The country's economy has reached new depth of collapse, and a third wave of the pandemic is threatening to crush the country's already fragile healthcare system. Humanitarian Affairs Chief Martin Griffiths told world leaders at the meeting, underscoring that the most vulnerable always bear the highest cost of the crisis. He said that females were not likely to be hungry, sick, or exposed to gender-based violence, and with little access to essential services, millions of internally displaced people face a daily struggle to survive. Yet, in a positive development, the UN official credited the international community for stepping up support to the country's humanitarian aid operation. Thanking the world leaders, he said that Yemen's humanitarian response plan is among the most well-funded, with 98% of the pledges made at an event in March fulfilled. With over 2 billion received, the UN and its partners were able to prevent famine and pull people back from the brink of despair, delivering assistance to every single one of the country's 333 districts. Despite these important achievements, many sectors still face alarming funding gaps, and humanitarians are working with less than 1/5 of the money needed to provide healthcare, sanitation and shelter. Without additional funding, these and other forms of critical life-saving support, including food assistance, will have to be reduced in the coming weeks and months, he warned. The UN Relief Chief asked global leaders to continue supporting Yemen's humanitarian operation, respect international humanitarian law and protect civilians, and address the root drivers of the crisis, including restrictions on imports which elevate the prices of essential goods. In the end, he also urged them to do everything in our collective power to stop this war, saying, "At the end of the day, peace is what will provide Yemenis with most sustainable form of relief."
In Hodeidah, the Joint Forces defenses shot down a Houthi drone in Al-Durayhimi, south of the city. A military source stated that the Houthi drone carried bombs and was flying over Al-Durayhimi. The drone was brought down immediately. The national resistance in Tohaita denounced the brutal genocide committed by the Houthi militia against 9 innocent people from Hodeidah last Saturday. Protesters affirmed that the terrible crime committed by the militia is added to a series of crimes against people of Tihama. They also denied the shameful silence of the United Nations, which had nothing but few words condemnation, without taking any punitive measures to curb barbarism of Houthis. In Hodeidah, members of Houthi militia were killed and others wounded in strikes on 3 fronts in the city. The military media reported that movements of the militia have been tracked near the contact lines northeast of the airport, 50th Street, Al Saleh City, and the 16th Kilo areas, and were thwarted at once. Despite their recent escalations on a number of fronts, Houthi militia has received strong blows and considerable losses in personnel and equipment. The following reports tracks the rebels' losses throughout different battlefields in Hodeidah.
In a new setback to the Houthi rebels in different fronts in Yemen, the joint forces inflicted heavy losses on the rebels in Hodeidah to the west of the country. The military media of the joint forces announced that in the past few hours the joint forces tracked and spotted members of the Houthi rebels to the west of Al-Hais city. The media said Houthi mobilized new deployment to the area, close to the contact lines with the joint forces. After spotting and tracking the Houthi movements in Hais, the joint forces clashed with the rebels and inflicted casualties among them. Other remaining Houthis managed to flee. The joint forces military media added that the clashes destroyed a Houthi artillery position and one of their P-10 vehicles. In Hodeidah, Houthi militia tried to penetrate the position of the joint forces that managed to control the main smuggler route south of Tohaita. The military media said the Houthi attempt was deterred by the vigilance of the joint forces there. The rebels tried to penetrate the lines of the joint forces in Al-Faza area in Tohaita. The penetration failed, and the rebels left behind a number of them killed and wounded. The same setback occurred to the militia in their attempt to infiltrate into joint forces position in the 16 area to the east of Hodeidah. The Houthis were confronted with fierce clashes with different types of medium and heavy weapons, causing casualties among them. Houthis lost lives too in positions between the governorates of Al-Bayda and Abyan to the center south of Yemen. The resistance forces fired mortars on the Houthi gatherings, followed by a shootout between the two sides. In Ma'rib, the strategic city, Houthis are trying in the past few days to secure again through pushing their fighter to the contact lines. The rebels try to penetrate the lines of the government forces that are backed by the tribes. A military source confirmed that the latter battled a number of Houthi penetration al-Qassara to the west of Ma'rib and caused heavy losses among them.
The Deputy Permanent Representative of Yemen to the United Nations said that the recent attack on Ma'rib led to the death of nearly 2,000 children recruited by the Houthi militia. This came in a meeting entitled Protecting Children in Armed Conflicts During Corona Pandemic, which was held under the auspices of the European Union, Belgium and Niger on the side of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. According to the Yemeni diplomat, Houthi militia has recruited more than 35,000 children since 2014, 17% of whom are under the age of 11, while a number of 6,729 is actively fighting on the Houthi fronts. Coming next. Al-Zainabiyat, a Houthi secret female tool to suppress Yemeni women.
أقول لك راحت بالغداء لأهلها شلت الغداء وراحت بأهلها في المزرعة. والمزرعة ركبت على حمار ما حتى نص المزرعة وانفجر فيها اللغم، دعست على اللغم وانفجر فيهم. الحمار انتهى الماء ترفت بكعت رجليها. كامل. نغير منها نغير الشبعلة اللي هي البيت سابحة من دور رجلين قبل صافناها طبية أقرب طبية وصافناها هنا بطلت رجليها كامل.
التزود هلي وقابل لي لعب وطبعته تحت الزوايا.
Welcome back. In Sana'a, economic sources revealed that Houthi militia arrested more than 137 traders, store owners and sellers after refusing the militia's orders to pay unofficial taxes. According to sources, the militia said those detainees wouldn't be released unless they pay extra fines. Since Houthi rebels seized Sana'a in 2014, they have committed different kinds of human rights violations in an apparatus that has cracked down all Yemenis. Al-Zainabiyat female secret police was established by Houthis to arrest and suppress vulnerable Yemeni women. More focus on this story is within this report.
The Yemeni Network for Rights and Freedom documented 6,476 violations committed by the Houthi militia against women, including killing, injury, kidnapping, enforced disappearance, and torture. In this context, the women's wing in the security apparatus of the Houthi militia, known as Al-Zainabiyat, expanded the violations against women in the militia-controlled areas. A campaign of raids and arrests was carried out by this wing against many female opposition activists, and monitoring teams were deployed in large commercial centers and beauty shops to monitor, lure, and blackmail women. Local sources stated that the Houthi militia raided a number of homes and took away a group of women working in government jobs. They were asked to choose between working with them or imprisonment and trial. Women's families receive explicit threats from members of the militia's intelligence of punishment or the fabrication of moral charges if they declared such arrests. Media sources reported that the Houthi militia carried out a campaign of arrests targeted dozens of female activists during the past days and held them in secret prisons. Those detained women are subjected to various types of violations and torture. Among the detainees are women employees in government departments, and some of them occupy leading positions as they were summoned from the Preventive Security Service, which is the intelligence service of the Houthi militia, and they were offered to work with the militia. Yet, those who refuse that offer are placed in a secret prison. Some of the female detainees succumbed to the threats and accepted to work with the militias out of fear from tarnishing their reputation, especially in a conservative society like Yemen. Families who do not allow daughters to cooperate with the militias received advice to remain discreet and not to raise the issue in the media on the promise to follow up the matter with the militia leadership and discuss it within the so-called the Supreme Political Council, which governs the militia-controlled areas. These dangerous actions amid the recent death sentences issued by the State Security Court in the militia authority against 11 people, including 2 women, without having been able to submit any legal defenses or assigning lawyers, resulted in families accepting the idea that there are political efforts by political leaders to release or pardon them. Eventually, as the most vulnerable always bear the highest cost of the war in Yemen, Yemeni women seem to have borne a really high cost, and what a cost.
International agencies working in Yemen have warned that humanitarian aids could be suspended due to shortage of funding. This surely will have severe consequences on lives of millions who struggle to survive through getting these aids. The following report has more details on that story.
Humanitarian partners in Yemen warn the United Nations of serious consequences if it proceeds with the decision to reduce relief programs, especially food aid, water support, and the health sector. This could lead to the death of thousands of malnourished and sick children, Further, they pointed out that the country's population increased during the war years by an amount of 6 million people, and with it increased humanitarian needs. The letter addressed to David Gressly, the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Yemen, came in response to his August 30 statement, in which he indicated that as of this September, some agencies may limit important programs, including water, health, and other sectors due to lack of funding. The message of the humanitarian partners in Yemen urged the United Nations to assume its responsibilities towards the millions of Yemenis who depend on these vital programs and projects, as the international organization has other options to fulfill its humanitarian and moral obligations. Civil society organizations working in partnership with UN organizations on the relief side affirmed that the consequences of reducing the programs of United Nations agencies will be catastrophic in terms of interruption of health services, cutting off water supplies, and the possible death of thousands of sick children. They stated that Yemen is now in the 7th year of the start of the civil conflict, and an entire generation of nearly 6 million Yemenis was born during the conflict, which indicates an increase in humanitarian needs. According to the organizations, donor countries should increase their humanitarian assistance in proportion to the requirements of resilience programs. This is important to mitigate the negative impact of a sudden future decline in humanitarian funding. Humanitarian partners in Yemen indicated that due to the restrictions imposed on the port of Hodeidah and the closure of the Taiz Road, the Sana'a-Ma'rib Road, and the Sana'a Airport, which serves nearly 60% of the population, the cost of basic life-saving humanitarian needs has increased due to the complications imposed by the parties to the war on imports. 22.2 million Yemenis need some kind of humanitarian assistance this year, and that humanitarian needs have received only 40% of the necessary funding. About 11.1 million people do not receive aid, and the number of people who need some kind of humanitarian assistance is about 5 times the population of Paris, and the humanitarian situation requires a real economic and diplomatic commitment to alleviate the disaster. Local partners called for building strategic partnerships between local and international organizations and United Nations agencies through long-term projects and increasing the number of representatives of the country team from 3 to 5 members, in addition to increasing the number of the humanitarian advisory team from 2 to 5 representatives so that they are chosen democratically and transparently by civil society organizations.
The Yemeni government called on the United Nations to disburse funds of international organizations operating in Yemen through the central bank to support the national economy and maintain the exchange rate. This comes at a time when the Yemeni currency is witnessing an unusual collapse amid the government's inaction. This in turn has overshadowed the entire economic scene in the country and doubled people's suffering. The Electricity Corporation in Aden announced gradual shutdown of the generating stations due to lack of fuel, despite the arrival of the 4th batch of the Saudi grant. According to Reuters, people of Aden said that hours of power cut rose on Friday to reach 10 hours in some cities. People also expressed their anger over the continued deterioration of living conditions and services, especially in terms of the electricity sector, with temperatures rising in the summer to more than 40 degrees. The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 31 new cases of the COVID-19 in 6 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 14 cases were recorded in Hadramaut, 7 in Aden, 5 in Ma'rib, 3 in Shabwa, and 2 in Taiz. Also, 9 deaths were recorded, plus 14 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 8,861, including 1,673 deaths and 5,470 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. U.S. Ambassador to United Nations Linda Greenfield says the U.S. is committed to achieving peace in Yemen. UN Humanitarian Affairs Chief Martin Griffiths calls upon world leaders to double humanitarian aids for Yemen. The joint forces thwart Houthi rebels' attacks in different fronts within Hodeidah. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.